The air in the courtroom hung heavy, thick with the scent of old wood and unspoken dread. Officer Brandt, once a towering figure of authority, now seemed shrunken, his once impenetrable arrogance having finally crumbled. His face, usually set in a sneer of dismissive superiority, was a mask of raw, undisguised terror, his eyes darting frantically between the stern face of the judge and the impassive jury. He clutched the lapels of his ill-fitting suit, a stark contrast to the crisp uniform he once wore with such insolent pride. "Officer Brandt," the prosecutor's voice cut through the silence, each word a hammer blow, "the jury finds you guilty on all counts: excessive force, racial profiling, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to violate civil rights." Brandt flinched, a low, strangled gasp escaping his lips. A rapid succession of images flashed across his mind: the smirking confidence of his superior officers, the veiled threats he'd issued to witnesses, the dismissive wave of his hand when a colleague had dared to question his methods. He saw the cold, unyielding gaze of Elias Vance, the grocery store owner, during their initial confrontation, a look he had fatally underestimated. He remembered the feeling of absolute impunity, the conviction that his badge, his connections, his skin, made him untouchable. But now, the reality of his downfall was stark, undeniable. The words of the judge, firm and unwavering, sealed his fate. The gavel struck, a sound like thunder, reverberating through the courtroom, through Brandt's very soul. He slumped in his chair, a broken man, the weight of his crimes finally crushing him. 6 months earlier. The aroma of freshly baked bread mingled with the sharp tang of ripening fruit and the earthy scent of ground coffee in Vance's provisions. It was more than just a grocery store, it was the vibrant, beating heart of the community. Elias Vance, a man in his late 40s with a quiet strength etched into his features and eyes that held both warmth and a keen intelligence, moved with practiced efficiency behind the counter. He greeted customers by name, offered a knowing nod to Mrs. Henderson, who always bought extra sour pickles, and shared a quick, genuine laugh with young Michael, who was struggling to carry a bag twice his size. Elias built his business on quality, fairness, and a deep understanding of his neighborhood. He knew every crack in the pavement outside and every family's preference inside. A familiar rumble preceded the arrival of a squad car, which pulled up directly outside. 2 uniformed officers, Miller and Chen, entered, their holstered weapons a stark contrast to the welcoming atmosphere. Elias offered them a small, affable smile. "Morning, Miller, Chen." "The usual today." "Morning, Elias." "You know it," Officer Miller replied, already heading towards the deli counter where a plate of freshly made sandwiches awaited. "Chen, grab those energy bars." "Training day." Officer Chen nodded, exchanging a respectful glance with Elias before moving to the aisle. It was a common sight. Vance's Provisions wasn't just a convenient stop, it was where most of the department got their lunch, their coffee, even catered their smaller precinct gatherings. Elias knew their orders, their preferences, sometimes even extending a quiet discount during leaner times. It was an unspoken understanding. Vance's Provisions literally fed half the police department, a testament to its integral role in the town's fabric. Just as Miller was about to pay, the front door swung open with a theatrical flourish, announcing the arrival of Officer Brandt. He was a burly man, mid-50s, with a perpetually dissatisfied set to his jaw and eyes that seemed to constantly scan for imperfection or defiance. His uniform, while meticulously clean, seemed to carry an invisible weight of authority, or perhaps, an inflated sense of it. He offered a curt, almost imperceptible nod to Miller and Chen, his gaze sweeping over the diverse clientele with an air of barely concealed judgment. "Vance," Brandt drawled, his voice a low rumble that seemed to cut through the cheerful hum of the store. He didn't ask, he stated. "Heard you've got a new kid stocking shelves. Young fella, dark skin. Is he even legal?" Elias's smile didn't waver, though a subtle, almost imperceptible hardening came into his eyes. "Mr. Davies is a diligent, law-abiding employee, Officer Brandt. He's also 18 and very much legal. Just like all my staff." His tone was polite, firm, devoid of any emotional flicker that Brandt might latch onto. Brandt snorted, a dismissive sound. "Right. Just checking. You know how these things go." He picked up an apple from a display, twirling it idly, not bothering to ask permission or offer payment. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible to an outsider, but Elias understood its intent, a quiet assertion of dominance, a microaggression designed to remind him of his place. Miller and Chen exchanged an uncomfortable glance but remained silent, a silent pact of non-interference that had become standard whenever Brandt was in one of his moods. Elias merely watched, his expression unreadable, already processing. A week later, the familiar rumble of Brandt's patrol car again announced his arrival advances provisions, but this time, the atmosphere was different. It was mid-afternoon, the usual lunch rush over, leaving only a few scattered customers and Elias's young employee, Jamal, meticulously arranging a display of organic produce. Brandt entered, not with the casual swagger of a regular, but with a deliberate, almost theatrical slowness. His gaze locked onto Jamal, then swept over the shelves, an unreadable intensity in his eyes. "Vance," Brandt barked, his voice sharper than usual. "Got a complaint. Loitering. Suspicious activity outside your establishment. Seen a young man, matching your employee's description, hanging around here earlier. Any idea about that?" Elias, who had been calmly wiping down the counter, looked up, his expression one of polite inquiry. "Officer," Jamal was on his lunch break, just like he is every day at this time. He was sitting on the bench outside, eating a sandwich. "That's hardly suspicious activity in front of his place of employment, is it?" Brandt stepped closer, his imposing frame filling the space between them. "Maybe not to you, Vance. But to the law, a young man like that, just sitting there, could be casing the joint. Or worse." His eyes narrowed, challenging. "You vouch for everyone who sits on that bench?" "I vouch for my employee, Officer Brandt," Elias replied, his voice calm and even, devoid of any emotional heat. "He's been with me for 2 years. Never a problem. I'd appreciate it if you didn't harass him for simply existing." Brandt's face tightened. He clearly expected a more submissive, perhaps even apologetic, response. Elias's composure seemed to infuriate him. "Harass? I'm conducting a routine investigation, Vance. Something you, as a business owner, should be supporting. Unless you have something to hide." His eyes flicked to a small security camera mounted near the entrance, then back to Elias. "Or maybe you're obstructing justice." Jamal, who had frozen at the produce display, began to visibly tremble. Elias, sensing the boy's fear, placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Officer, you are disrupting my business and frightening my employee on baseless accusations. If you have a legitimate complaint, please provide specifics, or I'll have to ask you to leave." The challenge, delivered with such quiet authority, seemed to break Brandt's fragile control. His face flushed a deep red. "Ask me to leave? Is that a threat, Vance? Are you resisting a police officer? I'm telling you, this is how it starts. Little acts of defiance, then it escalates." He pulled out his handcuffs with a theatrical flourish, the metallic clink echoing through the suddenly silent store. "Officer Brandt, I am not resisting," Elias stated, his voice still steady, though his eyes now held a chilling clarity. "I am asserting my rights as a citizen and a business owner. You have no probable cause for an arrest." "Probable cause?" Brandt scoffed, advancing. "I've got a public disturbance, obstruction, and frankly, you're looking pretty agitated, Vance. That's enough for me." He grabbed Elias's arm roughly, twisting it behind his back with practiced force. The customers gasped, some murmuring in disbelief. Jamal cried out, "Mr. Vance." "Silence, boy." Brandt snarled, tightening his grip on Elias. "You're next if you don't keep your mouth shut." He clicked the handcuffs shut, the sound sharp and final. "Elias Vance, you're under arrest for resisting arrest and disturbing the peace. Anything you say can and will be used against you." As Brandt marched Elias out of his own store, past the horrified faces of his customers, Elias kept his head held high. His expression remained unreadable, a cool, calculating gaze fixed forward. He offered no struggle, no verbal protest, just a silent, profound understanding of the deep injustice. Brandt, puffed with a sense of triumph, seemed to miss the almost imperceptible flicker in Elias's eyes, a spark of cold resolve, not defeat. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The chill of the holding cell had done little to penetrate Elias Vance's calm. He sat on the hard bench, his hands still bearing the faint red marks from the handcuffs, but his mind was already miles away, meticulously replaying the incident. The flimsy charges, the public humiliation, Brandt's smug satisfaction, it was all precisely what Elias had anticipated. He knew the local system, knew its weak points, its blind spots, and most importantly, knew the deep-seated complacency that allowed men like Brandt to operate with impunity. This wasn't a sudden outburst, it was the inevitable culmination of a pattern, and Elias was ready. After a few hours, a trusted friend from the community posted his bail. The lawyer, a young woman named Maya Rodriguez who owed Elias a favor for countless family meals, met him outside the station. "Elias, are you okay? What happened in there? They're saying you resisted arrest." Elias offered a faint, reassuring smile. "I'm fine, Maya. And I did not resist. But Officer Brandt certainly made it look that way. Don't worry about the local charges for now. Just get the preliminary report. We won't be fighting this battle in their arena." His voice was low, thoughtful, devoid of any anger or bitterness, only a quiet determination. Maya, though puzzled, had learned to trust Elias's judgment. Back home, in his small, meticulously organized study, Elias shed the day's events like a coat. He didn't rant, didn't punch walls. Instead, he moved with a deliberate, almost ritualistic precision. He unlocked a discreet, fireproof cabinet tucked away behind a shelf of cookbooks. Inside, among neatly labeled folders, was a thick, worn binder. It wasn't a diary of grievances, it was a dossier. He pulled out a folder specifically marked Brandt, O. Inside, there were dates, times, incident reports, witness names, snippets of audio recordings, and even a few blurry stills from various security cameras around town, all meticulously catalogued over years. Complaints dismissed, internal investigations whitewashed, verbal abuses swept under the rug. Elias wasn't just a grocery store owner, he was a silent archivist of injustice. He then pulled out a secure, encrypted satellite phone, an unassuming device that looked like any other, but was anything but. He composed a short, coded message, reviewing it twice before hitting send. The message wasn't addressed to local law enforcement, or even the state attorney general. It was destined for a very specific, very discreet unit within the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice. This wasn't an impulsive act of retribution. This was the activation of Elias's hidden mechanism, a carefully cultivated back channel, a lifeline to a higher, impartial system of justice he had helped establish or at least maintain for years. After witnessing too many local failures, after seeing too many good people crushed by systemic apathy and corruption, Elias had understood that true change sometimes required bypassing the rotten roots and reaching directly for the federal branches. He had worked quietly, patiently, building trust and providing credible intelligence over time to federal contacts who shared his commitment to accountability. His arrest, as infuriating as it was merely the final, undeniable piece of evidence needed to trigger the larger, more powerful investigation. Elias closed his dossier, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. The game had just begun, and Brandt, in his arrogant blindness, had no idea he was already playing on a much larger, and far more dangerous, field. The days following Elias Vance's arrest settled into an uneasy calm. Officer Brandt continued his patrols with an air of heightened self-importance, relishing the visible deference, or fear, he now commanded among certain segments of the community. At the precinct, the official narrative was that Vance had been uncooperative and provocative, a story swallowed whole by many, reinforced by the lack of any immediate, public pushback. Life, outwardly, seemed to return to normal. But beneath the surface, faint tremors began. A week after Elias's bail, two individuals, impeccably dressed but unremarkable in appearance, arrived in town. They introduced themselves as consultants for a regional economic development firm, making polite inquiries about local businesses, community relations, and the general public sentiment towards local governance. Their questions were always phrased innocuously, but they held a persistent, almost scientific curiosity about the local police department and its interactions with minority-owned businesses. One, a sharp-featured woman named Agent Anya Sharma, possessed an uncanny ability to disarm with a smile while extracting precise details. The other, a quiet, observant man named Agent David Chen, no relation to the local officer, moved with the understated efficiency of someone who missed nothing. They frequented local diners, coffee shops, and even, subtly, Vance's provisions, engaging Elias in seemingly casual conversations about his business, his customer base, and the challenges of being a local entrepreneur. Elias, recognizing the subtle cues, spoke with the same quiet authority he always did, providing measured responses that were factual, objective, and devoid of personal animosity, yet precisely the kind of information they needed. Seems like you have a good relationship with the local officers, Mr. Vance, Agent Sharma remarked over a cup of Elias's specialty coffee. I see a few come in here regularly. Elias nodded. Most of them are decent men and women. They're part of the community, just like anyone else. He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, though, like any institution, there are always a few exceptions. People who might benefit from a refresher on community policing. Sharma's eyes, bright and intelligent, met his for a fraction of a second. She offered a small, knowing smile. Indeed. Transparency and accountability are key, aren't they? Meanwhile, Officer Brandt and his inner circle felt the first, almost imperceptible shifts. Random audits of patrol logs and incident reports were initiated, just routine, the internal affairs captain assured them, but the scrutiny felt tighter, the questions more pointed. Calls for backup from Brandt's patrol car seemed to take just a fraction of a second longer to be answered. Anonymous emails landed in the inboxes of local journalists, hinting at unresolved issues within the police department, though without specifics. The initial smugness began to fray, replaced by a low thrum of irritation and a nascent unease. They were just small things, easily dismissed as coincidence, but to those who were watching, they were the first ripples of a much larger tide. The consultants from the regional economic development firm soon shed their innocuous cover. Agents Sharma and Chen, now openly identifying as federal investigators from the Civil Rights Division, began to execute their duties with a quiet, unyielding authority. Their first official act was a formal request to the local police department for all records pertaining to Elias Vance's arrest, Officer Brandt's service history, and any past complaints lodged against him. Captain Davies, the head of internal affairs, a man whose career was built on keeping the precinct's dirty laundry strictly internal, met them with a veneer of practiced cordiality. Federal inquiry, he mused, leaning back in his chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Usually, we handle our own matters. We're a tight-knit community here. And we appreciate that, Captain, Agent Sharma responded, her voice smooth but firm. However, allegations of civil rights violations fall squarely within our jurisdiction. We require immediate access to all requested documents and personnel files. Captain Davies sighed, a show of mild inconvenience. Of course. Standard procedure. You'll find Officer Brandt's file is impeccable. A few minor complaints over the years, naturally, comes with the territory, but nothing ever substantiated. Mr. Vance, while a respected member of the community, was, by all accounts, uncooperative during his arrest. He pushed a slim folder across the desk. Here's Brandt's official file. Not much to see. Agent Chin silently took the folder, his eyes scanning the sparse contents. We'll also need access to all body camera footage from the incident, dashcam recordings, and any internal communications related to Mr. Vance's arrest, he stated, his gaze direct. And a full list of all complaints, formal and informal, made against Officer Brandt throughout his career, regardless of outcome. Captain Davies's smile faltered. Informal complaints. We don't necessarily archive every disgruntled citizen's grumbling, Agent. And body camera footage, sometimes these things have technical glitches, you understand. His evasiveness was a clear tell, a red flag to the seasoned federal agents. Undeterred, Sharma and Chin systematically began their interviews. They spoke with Jamal, Elias's young employee, who, initially terrified, found courage in the agent's calm, professional demeanor. He recounted Brandt's aggressive behavior, the baseless accusations, and Elias's unwavering composure. They then spoke with other customers who witnessed the arrest, collecting consistent accounts of Brandt's intimidation tactics and Elias's lack of resistance. The agents also started quietly interviewing other officers, not in official interrogation rooms, but in neutral spaces, over coffee, probing the departmental culture. They quickly discovered a palpable undercurrent of resentment towards Brandt, particularly among younger, more ethically minded officers. Whispers of his past racist remarks, his bullying, and his penchant for fabricating pretexts for stops began to surface. Some officers, weary of the department's complacency, subtly guided the agents towards specific, overlooked incidents or individuals who had previously tried to report Brandt's misconduct, only to be silenced or ignored by Captain Davies's internal affairs. Then came the physical evidence. The body camera footage from the incident, initially presented as corrupted, was meticulously recovered by federal forensic specialists. It painted a damning picture, Brandt's aggressive provocation, Elias's calm, legal responses, and the officer's disproportionate, vindictive escalation to arrest. It was a stark contradiction to the local police report. Furthermore, cross-referencing Elias's meticulously compiled dossier with the department's official records began to expose the stark discrepancies. Dates, times, and victims of Brandt's previous incidents, documented by Elias, often had no corresponding entry in the internal affairs files, or were dismissed with a perfunctory, no merit stamp. It became clear that Captain Davies and possibly others had actively suppressed or buried legitimate complaints, creating a shield of impunity around Brandt. The federal inquiry was no longer just about one racist arrest, it was beginning to unravel a systemic cover-up. The first layer of the local, corrupt system was being peeled back, exposing the rot underneath. The federal investigation, initially a subtle hum, was now a resonant drum throughout the local police department. Agents Sharma and Chen, armed with the recovered footage and the glaring discrepancies between Elias's dossier and Captain Davies's impeccable files, moved with renewed purpose. They didn't just find isolated incidents, they uncovered a pattern, a playbook for brushing aside inconvenient truths. One particularly damning discovery was a series of internal memos, flagged by a disgruntled junior clerk who had anonymously tipped off the federal agents. These memos, dating back years, documented instances where legitimate complaints against Brandt, ranging from aggressive traffic stops targeting minority drivers to the use of racially charged language during arrests, had been officially reviewed by Captain Davies himself, only to be filed away with minimal, if any, follow-up. In some cases, witness statements were clearly fabricated or coerced to exonerate Brandt. The walls of secrecy around Brandt's history, so carefully constructed by local command, were beginning to crack. The irony of Vance's provisions, the very store whose owner Brandt had publicly humiliated, supplying the police department, became a central, biting point of the investigation. Federal agents requested all invoices, catering receipts, and supply orders from the department to Vance's provisions. The sheer volume was staggering. Not only did individual officers regularly purchase meals, but the department had a long-standing contract with Elias for catering precinct events, training days, and community outreach functions. Elias had consistently offered discounts, sometimes even extending credit, fostering goodwill that Brandt had so casually shattered. Agent Sharma presented this evidence during an increasingly tense meeting with Chief Thompson, a man who had previously enjoyed a reputation for maintaining peace in his community, largely by ignoring internal problems. Chief Thompson, she stated, laying out a stack of invoices, your department relies heavily on Mr. Vance's business, not just for food, but for maintaining a positive image within the community. Yet, Officer Brandt, with a documented history of racial bias, was allowed to publicly arrest and humiliate Mr. Vance on fabricated charges, precisely because he believed he was untouchable within your command structure. Chief Thompson, his face a mask of carefully controlled anger, sputtered, Brandt is one officer. We cannot be held accountable for every rogue element. But you are, Chief, Agent Chin interjected, his voice quiet but penetrating. Because your internal affairs, led by Captain Davies, actively buried complaints against him. Because your department benefited from Mr. Vance's generosity while allowing one of your officers to terrorize him and his community. This isn't about a rogue element. This is about a systemic failure, a culture of complicity. Panic began to ripple through the local police hierarchy. Captain Davies, realizing the depth of the federal probe, tried desperately to cover his tracks. He ordered subordinates to clean up Brandt's physical file, to redact certain incident reports, or even to claim documents were lost in a recent database migration. But the federal agents, anticipating such moves, had already secured digital copies and physical evidence through legal channels, making Davies's frantic efforts not only futile but also providing fresh evidence of obstruction of justice. The investigation unearthed more than just Brandt's racist acts. It revealed smaller, interwoven corruption schemes, the misuse of departmental funds for personal luxuries, officers clocking in overtime for shifts they didn't work, and a subtle quid pro quo system where minor infractions of connected citizens were overlooked in exchange for favors. Brandt, it turned out, was just one, albeit prominent, symptom of a much larger rot. Word began to leak to the local media, initially as vague reports of a federal review of the police department. But as the federal agents made their presence more overt, conducting interviews in public spaces and serving subpoenas, the story gained traction. Local journalists, long stifled by the department's tight-lipped control, began digging. The public, initially confused, grew increasingly alarmed. The reputation of the police department, once a source of local pride, was crumbling. Some of the good police officers, those who had quietly seethed under Brandt's arrogance and the departmental complacency, saw their chance. Officer Miller, who had witnessed Brandt's initial microaggressions, and Officer Chen, who felt a deep sense of betrayal by his own leadership, quietly approached the federal agents. They provided crucial insider information, confirming the cover-ups, detailing instances where they were pressured to ignore Brandt's behavior, and offering accounts of the toxic culture that had allowed him to thrive. Their testimonies were not just acts of conscience, they were a desperate attempt to salvage the integrity of their institution, to sever the diseased limb before it infected the entire body. The web of local protection, once impenetrable, was now unraveling thread by thread, exposing its fragility and the complicity of those who had woven it. The escalating federal investigation, now impossible to ignore, ripped through the community like a wildfire. Local news outlets, initially cautious, now ran daily headlines detailing unprecedented federal scrutiny of the police department. Regional newspapers picked up the story, casting a harsh national spotlight on the small town. The once whispered rumors of Officer Brandt's misconduct and the department's systemic issues were now shouted from every digital and print platform. Officer Brandt, whose arrogant confidence had been slowly eroded by the relentless federal pressure, now teetered on the brink of outright panic. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a twitchy, defensive aggression. He became increasingly isolated, even his staunchest former allies in the department now keeping a wide berth, fearing guilt by association. His attempts to intimidate witnesses, particularly those who had seen him arrest Elias, became more desperate and clumsier. He would show up at their workplaces, making veiled threats about trouble if they spoke to the outsiders, or drive slowly past their homes, a silent, menacing presence. But these actions, far from deterring, only provided the federal agents with fresh evidence of witness tampering and obstruction. "He's unraveling," Agent Sharma noted to Agent Chen, reviewing a compiled report of Brandt's recent activities. "His arrogance prevents him from admitting defeat, so he's doubling down on the intimidation. It's almost textbook." Chief Thompson and Captain Davies, the architects of Brandt's protection, found themselves caught in a public relations nightmare and a legal vice. Their attempts to control the narrative were utterly failing. Press conferences were disasters, their vague denials and assurances ringing hollow against the backdrop of mounting federal evidence and the increasingly vocal community. The once loyal city council, facing public outrage and potential legal liabilities, began to openly distance themselves from the police leadership, initiating their own independent review, a transparent attempt to mitigate the damage. In a desperate, ill-conceived move, Captain Davies ordered a counter-investigation, attempting to dig up dirt on Elias Vance. He dispatched junior officers to interview Elias's competitors, former employees, and even distant relatives, hoping to find any smudge on his character that could discredit him. The officers, many of whom respected Elias, carried out their orders with visible reluctance, and the investigation yielded nothing but glowing testimonials about Elias's integrity and community spirit. The only effect was to further alienate the officers from their leadership and solidify the public's perception of Elias as a man unfairly targeted. The revelation that Vance's provisions had been a primary food supplier for the police department for years, providing discounts and goodwill, became a particularly potent symbol of the department's hypocrisy. A local editorial cartoon depicted a starved police officer, Badge Askew, reaching desperately for a loaf of bread, while a calm, strong Elias Vance stood behind a counter, holding a sign that read, "Justice served." The image resonated deeply with the community. Amidst the chaos, Elias Vance remained a pillar of quiet strength. He continued to run his store, maintaining his serene demeanor. He spoke to the media only when necessary, his statements always factual, measured, and focused on systemic issues rather than personal vendettas. "This isn't about me," he told a local reporter, his voice steady. "It's about ensuring that everyone in this community, regardless of who they are, can expect fair treatment and accountability from those sworn to protect them." His quiet dignity stood in stark contrast to the frantic, panicked maneuvering of the police leadership. The pressure reached a breaking point when the federal grand jury, after hearing extensive testimony and reviewing the mountain of evidence, issued multiple indictments. Officer Brandt was indicted on several felony counts, including civil rights violations under color of law, obstruction of justice, and false arrest. More shockingly, Captain Davies and two other high-ranking officers were also indicted for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to violate civil rights, directly implicating them in the systemic cover-up. The news sent shockwaves through the department, signaling an end to the culture of impunity. The walls of complicity, once thought impregnable, had not just crumbled, they had been atomized. The day of reckoning was rapidly approaching. The indictments transformed the atmosphere in the town from one of simmering tension to outright anticipation. The trial of Officer Brandt, Captain Davies, and their co-conspirators became the most talked-about event in recent memory, a focal point for the community's hopes for justice and accountability. The local police department, now under interim leadership and facing federal oversight, was a ghost of its former self, its officers walking on eggshells, its once proud facade shattered. Agents Sharma and Chen, along with a team of federal prosecutors, meticulously prepared their case. The sheer volume of evidence was overwhelming, body camera footage undeniably showing Brandt's aggression and Elias's calm compliance, the recovered internal memos detailing Captain Davies' systematic burial of complaints, the testimony of numerous witnesses, including several courageous police officers, who corroborated the pattern of abuse and cover-up, and of course, Elias Vance's own meticulously compiled dossier, which proved invaluable in tracing the history of Brandt's misconduct and the department's complicity. Elias, though central to the case, maintained his characteristic reserve. He spent hours with the prosecution team, calmly reviewing documents, recalling minute details, and preparing for his testimony. He wasn't seeking vengeance, he was seeking justice, a distinction that underscored his motivation. "This isn't just for me," he reiterated to Agent Sharma, "it's for every person Brandt and others like him have harassed, intimidated, or wrongfully accused. It's for the trust that was broken between the department and the community." Officer Brandt, now facing the full, terrifying weight of federal prosecution, was a shadow of his former self. His legal counsel, a high-priced, slick defense attorney hired by the police union, attempted every conceivable maneuver to discredit the federal investigation. They filed motions to suppress evidence, argued against the jurisdiction of the federal court, and attempted to paint Elias Vance as a disgruntled opportunist. But the federal team was prepared for every tactic. The evidence was too robust, the witnesses too credible, and Elias's integrity too unimpeachable. Captain Davies and the other indicted officers, facing their own legal battles, tried to distance themselves from Brandt, each attempting to shift blame onto the others. Their internal finger-pointing and backbiting only served to further expose the depth of their conspiracy and their cynical disregard for justice. Federal prosecutors used their conflicting statements to build an even stronger case of concerted obstruction. The prosecution team made a strategic decision to highlight the "feeding the department" aspect of Vance's provisions. It wasn't just a quirky detail, it was a powerful symbol of betrayal. They planned to show how Elias, through his business, had literally sustained the department, built goodwill, and demonstrated commitment to the community, only to have that goodwill savagely repaid with humiliation and false arrest by an officer protected by the very institution he supported. As the trial date loomed, the tension reached its zenith. Elias received messages of support from across the community and beyond. His store, far from suffering, became a rallying point, a symbol of resilience. People came from neighboring towns to express solidarity, leaving flowers, cards, and even small donations. On the eve of the trial, Elias sat in his quiet study, reviewing his notes one last time. He wasn't nervous. He had played his hand, meticulously, patiently. The hidden mechanism he had activated years ago, born of foresight and a deep understanding of systemic failures, had worked. The federal machine, slow to start but inexorable once in motion, was now poised to deliver a justice that the local system had consistently denied. He closed his binder, a quiet sense of purpose settled within him. The stage was set. Judgment Day awaited. The courtroom, packed to capacity, buzzed with a nervous energy that transcended the usual decorum of legal proceedings. Every seat was filled, local and regional media jostled for position, and the faces of the community members reflected a mixture of hope, apprehension, and a palpable thirst for justice. Officer Brandt, clad in a pale, ill-fitting suit, sat at the defense table, his eyes sunken, his once imposing posture now a mere slouch. Captain Davies and the other indicted officers occupied a separate table, their expressions a mixture of fear and thinly veiled resentment towards Brandt, the catalyst for their downfall. The prosecution began with a powerful opening statement, delivered by Assistant U.S. Attorney Ramirez. He painted a picture of a community betrayed, of trust shattered by a pattern of racial bias and a cynical cover-up by those sworn to protect. He introduced Elias Vance not as a victim, but as a pillar of the community, whose unwavering integrity and quiet courage brought to light systemic injustices. Elias Vance was the prosecution's first key witness. He walked to the stand with the same measured calm he exhibited behind the counter of Vance's provisions. His testimony was a masterclass in composed, factual recall. He recounted the incident of his arrest in detail, his voice steady, devoid of emotion, focusing on the objective facts, Brandt's baseless accusations, his escalation, and the public humiliation. He presented his meticulously kept records, cross-referencing dates and times with the prosecution's evidence, showing a clear pattern of harassment and discrimination. "And at any point, Mr. Vance, did you resist Officer Brandt's orders?" AUSA Ramirez asked. "No, sir. I calmly asserted my rights, as any citizen is entitled to do," Elias replied, his gaze unwavering as he met Brandt's venomous glare across the courtroom. Officer Brandt chose to escalate the situation beyond any reasonable justification. The prosecution then presented the recovered body camera footage. The courtroom fell silent as the video played, vividly showing Brandt's aggressive posturing, his increasingly hostile tone, and the moment he roughly cuffed Elias, who remained utterly composed. The visual evidence was devastating, directly refuting the defense's narrative of a resisting and agitated Elias. Following Elias, Jamal, his young employee, gave a tearful but firm account of the intimidation he faced, lending a human face to Brandt's casual cruelty. Then came a parade of other witnesses, local residents who had previously filed complaints against Brandt, officers who had bravely stepped forward to expose the internal corruption, and even Officer Miller and Chen, whose testimonies detailed the pressure they faced to ignore Brandt's misconduct and the systemic cover-up orchestrated by Captain Davies. The climax arrived with the testimony of a forensic IT specialist who presented evidence of Captain Davies' attempts to clean up Brandt's digital files, directly linking him to the obstruction of justice. Screenshots of deleted emails, timestamps of file modifications, and recovered communications between Davies and Brandt solidified the conspiracy. The prosecution then highlighted the irony of Vance's provisions. AUSA Ramirez projected a slide showing the total value of catering and supply orders from the police department to Elias's store. "This department, members of this very department," he stated, his voice rising, "relied on Mr. Vance's integrity, his hard work, and his generosity to literally feed their officers and staff. And in return, Officer Brandt, with the explicit knowledge and protection of Captain Davies and others, sought to destroy him and the trust he had built." Brandt's defense attorney, despite his considerable skill, found himself with little ground to stand on. His attempts to sow doubt were systematically dismantled by the overwhelming, irrefutable evidence. He tried to portray Brandt as an overworked officer making a split-second decision under pressure, but the pattern of behavior and the systemic cover-up spoke volumes. Finally, the jury deliberated. The wait was agonizing for the community, but for Elias, it was merely the final act of a carefully orchestrated plan. When the jury foreman rose, the air crackled with anticipation. "We the jury find the defendant, Officer Brandt, guilty on all counts." A collective gasp, then a wave of relief washed over the courtroom. Brandt slumped, defeated. "We the jury find the defendant, Captain Davies, guilty on all counts of obstruction of justice and conspiracy to violate civil rights." Davies's face, already ashen, turned a ghastly shade of green. The judge's voice, clear and resonant, began to read the sentencing. It was the full, unvarnished scene from the prologue, the terrifying descent of the once untouchable. Brandt's eyes, now devoid of any spark, stared blankly ahead, finally comprehending the devastating consequences of his fatal underestimation. Justice, slow and methodical, had arrived. The judge's gavel fell one final time, a resonant echo of the justice delivered. Officer Brandt received a substantial prison sentence, a stark and unambiguous message that the badge did not confer impunity. Captain Davies and the other indicted officers also faced severe consequences, substantial prison time for their roles in the conspiracy and obstruction of justice, stripping them of their pensions and their reputations. The local police department, already reeling, was placed under federal consent decree, mandating sweeping reforms, retraining programs, and robust oversight mechanisms to prevent such abuses from ever recurring. The verdict sent shockwaves through the town, then a wave of profound relief and quiet celebration. The community, once fractured by fear and distrust, began to heal, empowered by the knowledge that their voices, through Elias Vance, had finally been heard. In the aftermath, the good officers who had cooperated with the federal investigation were instrumental in the department's painful but necessary transformation. Officer Miller and Chen, among others, became leaders in the reform efforts, working to rebuild trust with the community they served. They spearheaded new initiatives, fostering transparency and accountability, and actively engaging with community leaders like Elias. Elias Vance, far from seeking the spotlight, quietly returned to his work at Vance's Provisions. His store, however, was no longer just a beloved local business, it had become a symbol. People from all walks of life, from lifelong residents to newly arrived federal monitors, frequented it. The once casual police customers now entered with a newfound respect, a humility born of reckoning. They didn't just buy food, they exchanged polite conversation, engaged in open dialogue, and sought to understand the community they were now truly committed to serving. One afternoon, Agent Sharma visited Elias, not in an official capacity, but as a friend. She purchased a coffee and leaned against the counter. "What you did, Elias," she began, a genuine admiration in her voice. "It took incredible foresight and courage. Most people would have just fought the local charges and been done with it. You saw the bigger picture." Elias smiled faintly, wiping down the counter. "Local solutions can only fix local problems, Agent Sharma. Some problems are systemic. You need a different kind of leverage for that. And sometimes, you have to be willing to play a long game." He gestured around his bustling store. "This is my community. And I believe in justice. Not just for me, but for everyone who walks through that door." The local news ran a follow-up story, detailing the police department's reforms and the positive impact on community relations. The article highlighted Elias Vance as a quiet hero, a catalyst for change. It ended with a quote from him: "True change doesn't happen with anger, but with strategy. It happens when you expose the darkness to the light, patiently and relentlessly, until there's no more shadow to hide in." The final scene shows Elias, late in the evening, after the last customer has left. He stands in the quiet solitude of his store, looking out at the darkened street. The neon sign of Vance's Provisions casts a warm glow, a beacon in the night. He is not gloating, nor is he burdened. There is a deep, abiding sense of peace and satisfaction in his eyes. He had identified the disease, meticulously prepared the cure, and administered it with an unwavering hand. The system, once corrupted and seemingly invincible, had been forced to bend, to break, and finally, to begin anew. The long game had been won, not with a roar, but with a quiet, strategic resolve that had ultimately brought forth a true, cathartic justice.